Good evening, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Tyler Gillespie and Jan Becker. Tyler Gillespie, a fifth-generation Floridian, is a poet and award-winning journalist. He has written for GQ, The Guardian, The Nation, Vice, and Salon. He is the author of Florida Man, Poems, and co-editor of The Awkward Phase, the uplifting tales of those weird kids you went to school with. Jan Becker has an MFA in creative writing from Florida International University, where she teaches creative writing and literature. She's on the regular faculty at Reading Queer Academy, where she teaches a boot camp for queer writers. Her work has appeared in High Alive Magazine, Colorado Review, Emerge, Brevity Poetry Review, Sliver of Stone, and the Florida Book Review, among other places. She was winner of the 2015 AWP Intro Journals Award in Nonfiction, and her first book, The Sunshine Chronicles, was published by Jitney Books, and I've put a link in the chat if you'd like to order it. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature right below the screen. And you can order copies of The Thing About Florida by pressing the green button below. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And so now, without further ado, let me welcome our guests to the screen.
Hi, y'all. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. So we're going to start the evening with just a brief reading. Jan's going to start reading, and then after she's done, I will read. Then we will do a short writing exercise together, and then Jan will ask me some questions, and then at the end, you can pop some questions in there, and then we will answer audience questions at the end. So I'm really excited to be here with y'all, and I'm excited to be here with Jan. So without further ado.
Hello. I'm going to read from the beginning of my book, The Sunshine Chronicles. Cover arts by Luis Barros from Miami. It's a compilation of Facebook posts, and it's written in reverse chronological order, so it goes backwards in time. And I started, so when I was writing the beginning of the book, I was actually writing like the end of the book. And there was Hurricane Matthew was coming in as I was writing it. So this is about the storm coming in. It's a 13-part poem. Friday, October 7th, 2016 at 12:56 a.m. Number 13. The square root of a hurricane is a cycle. Already the next stage of this one is beginning. In Haiti, Jamaica, and the Bahamas, they're clearing roads, putting back on the rooftops, and counting too many dead. It's so quiet in my building right now, I want to tiptoe and do everything by candlelight. This kind of quiet can only exist against the bluster of a tempestuous night. Clouds will block the azure for a few more days, but on Sunday, there will be sunshine in Florida, and the birds will fall against the lake as they grab at fish with their talons. An iguana will glow greener on the lawn as he warms himself. One of the hardest lessons I've had to learn is that what I miss most right now has not necessarily vanished forever. I can be certain of little in life, aside from impending sunshine. 11:07 p.m. Number 12. Before the storm came, I was bitten by a spider while moving balcony furniture indoors. The storm is growing louder now. Sometimes it sounds the way an angry mob turns into an unintelligible roar. The wound from the spider has grown into a furious lump on my shoulder, and a perfect purple circle surrounds the edges. At the center, there's a blister, or is it an eye? 8:39 p.m. Don't tell my mother this, but I like to shower outside in big storms. 7:57 p.m. A hurricane is a kind of tropical cyclone. Cyclone from the Greek for coiled snake. In Zimbabwe, there's an invasive plant called cyclone wheat that is choking the fruit trees. It may have blown over from Mozambique during a cyclone. It had been brought from Brazil to lure honeybees. I haven't seen a honeybee in a very long time. 7:43 p.m. Number 9. A storm in the dark is more menacing than in the day. It is all sound, growing fury. Right now it is the rustle of palm fronds and tapping of raindrops at the windows. A stranger becoming bolder at the threshold. Number 8. When I search with my zip code to check the current weather, Haifa, Israel pops up. Pompano Beach is a long way from Israel, where it is a moonlit 73 degrees Fahrenheit right now. When they wake up in Haifa tomorrow, it will be sunny. Here the storm will have landed and the sky will be dark, turgid, and agitated. 2:32 p.m. Number 7. The word hurricane comes from the Spanish word huracán, which comes from the name of the Taíno storm god Huracan. The Taínos believe that Huracan dwelled on El Yunque mountain and sent strong winds and rain upon them when they pissed him off. Number 6. When Hurricane Bob hit Boston, I left my now ex-husband behind in Brighton for a friend's house in Quincy where there was liquor, marijuana, and a brother with a beautiful smile. Bob was still far away as I inched through traffic in the sublime air of Dorchester. The Scorpions were on the radio when lightning struck my car, a 1984 Plymouth Horizon named Edna, which stalled. Horns began beeping and a man yelled out, "Hey, you can't park the car now." I was surprised when the engine turned over. My radio was fried, but I've always hated that song anyway. Number 5. There has never been a Hurricane Jan. It would be a Category 6. Number 4. I remember air before landfall is vivid electric, charged with possibility and possibly colored like the moment the water hits the absinthe, like the sudden tinge of peridot on a Lunamont's wing. Someone should name that color sublime. Number 3. I have loved men who were like tidal pools, calm and focused, safe places to nurse gashes from being tossed against the rock. But a man like him, there's nothing like being swept up in his stormy arms for mutual destruction. Number 2. In another place, a typhoon and a hurricane might be the same. When we lived in Hawaii and Dad was off training in Okinawa, a hurricane's cousin hit the island and our house began to flood. My mother woke me up close to dawn to help her bail. I don't remember before dawn prior to that day. When the sun came up, we took a drive to survey the damage, and it looked like a giant had run over the mountains to play javelin toss with the coconut palms. I still look for the giant in any big storm. 13 ways of looking at a hurricane. Number 1. When Gloria hit Massachusetts, the CVs evacuated the base we lived on, and instead of going to a shelter, we hunkered down in my dad's office at a recruiting station in Quincy. I looked up at one point, saw a window in the building across the street get sucked out of its pane. It hung there, suspended in the air for a second, and then shattered into tiny bits of glass that peppered the street like snow. So that's just sort of a taste of the book. But we're all here to see hear Tyler. So I'm going to turn it over to Tyler. Congratulations on your book, Tyler.
Thank you so much, and thank you for reading. I love that line about there's no Hurricane Jan. It should be a Category 6. So I'm going to read from sections from 2 chapters, and the first one I'm going to read from, I've dropped a link into the chat about the excerpt was published on LitHub, so if you want to read along, if that's more accessible for you. And this is from a chapter called Florida Man Theory. I have a theory that any true Floridian is less than 5 degrees of separation from a Florida Man story. A headline like Florida Man in pirate costume arrested for firing black powder guns. My theory rests on a Floridian knowing the neighbor's son, a Florida man learns hard way that he stole laxatives, not opioids. Since Florida Man can also be Florida woman, a Floridian might know a friend's cousin who went viral as Florida woman charged with stealing rental car, says demons took it. In my case, a family member called the cops when a drug deal went wrong. Her dealer tried to rob her, and she wanted him to get arrested. I found the pre-viral Florida Man story in one local newspaper. The story happened in the early 2000s, so it's all but buried on the internet. In the mid-2000s, Fark.com, a website with the tagline, "We don't make the news, we mock it," began to track weird Florida news and contributed to the genesis of Florida as an internet meme. A major increase in searches for the term Florida man later occurred in June 2012, around the time of the viral Miami cannibal story. A guy had reportedly smoked bath salts and chewed off the face of a homeless man who had passed out near a road. The cannibal story was shocking, fear-inducing, twisted, and sad. The victim went through a slow and difficult recovery. The story was also morbidly intriguing to some, and it became a primer for Florida man, who has been described as a Yankee nightmare in human form, and everything frightening about white trash life in one meme. So now I'm going to skip to a different section. So part of the book has some archival research in it. Floridians have never exactly maintained a pristine reputation. We've behaved badly since statehood. Historians called antebellum Florida a rogue's paradise. Those Floridians like to carry weapons, and alcohol may have led to frontier violence. A penchant for alcohol and violence persisted and may have contributed to 1895's reported cutting affray. When Chaz stepped in front of Sam in line at the butcher shop, Sam's brother ran into the butcher shop to get a knife. He tried to stab Chaz. The scrum lasted until blood was seen, and the perpetrators fled to the woods to face later arrest. I could almost understand fighting over a long wait for a good piece of meat, but I couldn't get down with the turn of the century man who killed his sweetheart. This story discussed a husband who asked his wife to stroll by sunlight through the meadow and green pastures. On this stroll, the wife apparently told him she could no longer be with him for all he is worth. 3 shots were fired. The paper made it seem like the husband killed his wife, but the jury held an inquest over the body, and the verdict was that the shooting was accidental. They let him go. So then the rest of that chapter kind of looks at reasons why Florida man became this viral kind of internet sensation. And then I also was able to spend some time with someone who had been a Florida man headline, and I was able to see what happened next. So I was really interested in what happened after the headline. And for her, it's kind of a redemption story because basically a week after her Florida headline, she went to rehab. And so I kind of chronicle that journey for her. She shared with me, and I was really, I love that story from her. And so now I'm going to skip ahead because we're going to do a brief writing exercise after this connected to animals. So I'm going to read a little bit about one of my favorite animals, and I think one of the most misunderstood animals, the alligator, of course, right? So this is from a chapter called Brief Encounters with Alligators, and it also connects to the viral Florida man headlines because I profile a woman who went viral for her headline about her alligator. So this is in basically the second section. And I know I'm giving a lot of context, but basically I was interested in how the alligator had functioned in Florida economy. So I was interested in ecotourism and stretching back to when they were in outhouses. And so I talk about alligator wrestling. And so this picks up after that section. Okay, so in Mary Thorne's show, the Floridian had swum with 41 alligators in a Central Florida pit. She worked with the gators every day and knew which ones were the most aggressive. I had a gator that on command would show his privates, she said. Another I could pick up and kiss right on the mouth. Mary, in her mid-50s, reminded me of my great-aunt Annie, who used to feed her backyard gators. I admired these Florida women because they didn't take bull from anyone or any animal. Mary cared for her first gator as a little kid. Her brothers owned a fish hatchery, and she fished gators out to play with her Barbie dolls. The mother of 7 never wrestled gators, but she did wrestle people. In a past life, she performed professionally under the name Biker Babe as part of the Triple X team. The great Malenko, who made a name for himself in championship wrestling, had trained her. Mary carried on the great Malenko's legacy after he died. She body slammed people for almost 40 years in the ring before she retired to perform with gators. I have been bitten twice by gators, she said, once in the head and once in the knee. Mary's job at the Gator Show led to the ownership of her first alligators. FWC staff members brought 5 little gators in an aquarium to her boss. He couldn't take care of them, so she decided to get her permit and take them home. The FWC said people could keep an American alligator for educational purposes, exhibition, or sale if they obtained the proper permits and license. There's a lot of people who own gators without their neighbors knowing, said Mary. They could be living next to you because in Florida, you can get a license to keep a gator inside and do education with it. License applicants had to demonstrate 1 year and 1,000 hours of substantial practical experience with the care of gators or other crocodilian species. Mary's gators, Rambo, Oscar, and Alyssa, had been poached as hatchlings and kept in a dark closet for years. They had little room to move in the small aquarium. Mary said they'd been in the dark for so long their immune system was shot. The gators couldn't function properly, so Mary began to give them physical therapy. She soon found out the extent of the damage done by the darkness. They couldn't take the sun. I had one sitting by the window, she said, and the filtered light through the window actually killed the gator. I asked Dr. Laura Brandt, senior wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, about the possibility of sun-sensitive gators. She said, perhaps they would have some sun sensitivity initially, like you would have if you were kept in the dark. Mary realized the gator's sun sensitivity. She thought, if humans can do sunscreen, then gators can too. That's how her gators ended up wearing clothes. She lathered them in sunscreen and dressed them in biker gear and a Santa outfit for Christmas. Somehow, she didn't lose a finger in the process. Mary's permits allowed her to keep alligators until they reached 6 feet in length. She did not live on the required acres of land needed to keep bigger gators. Mary planned to rehab the gators and take them to the facility like Gatorland in Orlando. Mary did this all for the gators except for Rambo. She didn't want to drop him off at one of the professional facilities because of his sun sensitivity. She feared his weakened immune system would get him eaten by the other gators. FWC told her she had to find Rambo a new home because of his size. As Rambo inched towards 6 feet, she found it difficult to part with him. Her son died during her battle for Rambo, and she became even more attached to the gator she had raised. I decided I wasn't going to get rid of Rambo, she said. They were going to have to shoot me before I got rid of him. And that's where I'm going to stop there. Okay, so now what I would like to do is a short 2-minute writing exercise. So since we can't be in the physical space together and, as we would like to be, I want us to do something with our bodies together. So we're just going to write privately. You don't have to share this, but if you want to, you can share it in the chat. And I'm going to write along with you. And the prompt is, what alligator reminds you the most, or not what alligator, Freudian slip, alligators remind me. What animal reminds you the most of Florida? And I'm going to drop that in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to give us 2 minutes to do this. I'm going to just time us, and I'm going to be writing along with us. So let me start my timer. Okay, so it's just 2 minutes, and it starts now. All right. Okay, my timer just went off. I'm going to post something in the chat. Iguanas, 100% yes. Okay. Lizards, 100%. Armadillos, iguanas, lizards with their brightly colored dewlaps, and push-up contest, yes. Thank you all so much for sharing and writing with me. That's just something that, you know, I appreciate very much. White ibis, manatees, yes, the sea cows. No, not too many words. We love that. The bearded dragon reminds me most of Florida, not because it's a native species, but because it's the first wildlife I encountered when I visited Miami for the first time in December 2020. I was on a recon mission from Boston, deciding if I could see myself in Miami. I probably walked 10 miles that weekend, and after lunch, where I stuffed myself with tacos and plantains, I left the restaurant to see a 4-foot orange and tan and white bearded dragon loafing along by the water. What a lovely image. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so that's kind of our activity, and I think we're gonna ask some questions, right? Okay.
So a few years ago, I went to Europe, and while I was in Europe, people would ask me where I was from, and I'd say America, and inevitably the response I'd get would be Disney World. So it's funny to think that Europe sees America as Disney World, but I think that the world sort of sees Florida as Disney World, which has it's got its own sanitized culture, and it's sort of contained. But if you look at Florida culturally, you could probably pack about 50 states into Florida. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the cultures that you encountered while you were researching your book.
I love that. Right. So it's interesting too the way that you made that connection, because there's the Epcot as well that has like you can drink around the world or eat around the world or whatever. I grew up going there. So you're right. I mean, y'all. I'm in the Tampa Bay area, so I'm currently near Clearwater Beach. And Tampa Bay has a very distinct culture compared to a place like Jacksonville or a place like Miami, right? And it can be different cities and also those neighborhoods and the cities. So some of the stuff that I talk about in the book is connected to your question, is thinking about Florida as the South and what that means, right? Because my family grew up identifying as Southern, right? But a lot of people don't consider Florida as Southern. So that's something that I kind of explore through Florida's connection to the Civil War and thinking about it as a Southern state. So I was really interested in Florida as the American South or not, specifically as connected to my family history. And I became really interested in that idea. Like, from what I know, none of my family, even though I'm a fifth generation, none of my family members that we know of fought in the Civil War. But I really became kind of interested in this idea of how I could have potentially fought in the Civil War for the Confederacy. And like, what does that legacy mean for me? And how do I kind of grapple with that? So those were kind of some of the cultures that I was most interested in. But I spent a lot of time in South Florida talking about iguanas and pythons, mostly in the Everglades and like Homestead area, and a lot of time in Central Florida. And then also they kind of say the more north you get in Florida, the more southern it becomes. But I think there's pockets of everything throughout the state.
Okay. What surprised you most while you were writing the book? What did you discover that surprised you the most?
How hard it is to write a book, but what surprised me the most about Florida is that the thing that pops into my head immediately, something that was surprising. So I write a chapter about growing up gay in the Southern Baptist Church, specifically in Florida. And so what was really cool about working with the University Press of Florida is that a lot of folks there, they know a lot about Florida themselves, right? And they're, and it goes through different process. But I was writing about that, and they made an interesting connection to me about how Florida was really into the creationist movement in terms of school curriculum, and how there was a really big push at a certain time in the state's history for creationism in school, and how that could have been a possibility. The school I went to was taught creationism, but statewide kind of curriculum. So I just found that really interesting, and I never thought about Florida as a religious, like that kind of religious aspect. So I found that super interesting personally, though that's probably not the most surprising. And another kind of interesting fact connected to religion is I write about the Joy MCCs, which are affirming churches, and they're accepting of different sexualities. And Florida has the most Joy MCC locations in the whole country. The church, it's not a denomination, but like the church didn't start in Florida, it started in California, which is kind of, I see the whole weird Florida, and from what I would read, it used to be weird California, and then it kind of moved to Florida. And I think it's going to go to Arizona, but we'll see, you know. So I just found like the connections to religion really interesting, because I don't immediately associate Florida with religion, specifically the Southern Baptist Church. So I found that very interesting. I didn't know a lot about Florida's role in the Civil War. I didn't really even honestly remember learning that as a child. The history that I knew was going to the Fountain of Youth in St. Augustine and drinking from the Fountain of Youth on vacation. So that was the kind of like mythology, like the mytho-historical elements of Florida. And so reading more about Florida being part of the Confederacy and supporting, you know, sending cattle was our main contribution to the Civil War. I was surprised by that. And so just a little bit about like how that informed writing was, then I would be writing about the Civil War, and then I'd hear this like fact about cattle and become really obsessed with that. And then so I have the next chapter after that is about cattle. And Florida has such a big production of cattle, which I just find so fascinating, because like you were saying, people identify Florida as Disney World, and it's so touristy and sanitized, but we have a really like long history to the land and like agriculture, which I know a lot of people know about, but it was interesting for me to learn more about.
Okay, this is your second Florida themed book. You also wrote Florida Man poems. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the process for both books and how it differed.
So I started writing this book before I started writing the poetry. And basically what happened is I started writing the book in 2015 in my final semester of grad school in New Orleans. And then I moved home to Largo. It's like the Tampa Bay area, which is 2 hours from Orlando. And I went to the University of Central Florida as an undergrad. So I moved home in May, and the Pulse shooting happened in June. So really quickly after I came home. And some of my friends were at Pulse that night. And so I immediately knew that I needed to go write about Pulse, because I'm a trained journalist. So I really wanted to figure out how I could contribute to my community. And for me, that was writing about it and getting information through journalism. And so anyway, after that process, I kind of, got a little depressed, and I put down the essays, because for me, essays, the way that I have structured this is like kind of investigation and trying to come up with answers for different questions that I have. And so the poems for me were an opportunity and a space to ask questions instead of having answers. Not saying that poems need to do anything or that essays need to do anything. Just the way like I was sitting with poems was I was asking a lot of questions. And so through writing the poems, I was able to work my way back into the essays. And there are some of the reporting from this book in that poetry as well. one that I immediately think of is there's this poem about alligator wrestling. And so I was doing interviews for alligators, and I heard this guy describe how he wrestled alligators. And it was so lyrical, and there was so much imagery. And, it was just, I heard it as a poem. So I knew, okay, well, to me, that can be like a poem, right? So then after I was writing the poetry, like I kind of was then able to get back into the prose. And so I think too, that's how I kind of approached that process. And I think as a prose writer, the poetry and like thinking about the image and thinking about concision and the word choice affects writing the prose as well. So, I mean, I think, of course, and I know we have some poets who write nonfiction in the chat. I just love when nonfiction writers and write poetry and vice versa. I think it's such a great interplay.
Okay, my last question. How has it been trying to launch a book during a pandemic?
It's been, I feel grateful that I've been able to have the space that I've been able to have and speak with the people and at the venues. Because of course I would love to be in person because I'm that kind of person. I talk with my hands, I talk with my body. I like to meet people, of course, and have that interaction. But I was thinking about it, like I probably wouldn't have been able to do too many events because we're right smack dab not in the middle of the semester, but it's the end of the semester, And I teach at Ole Miss in Mississippi, so I wouldn't have been able to spend as much time in Florida just thinking logistically about it, right? So I feel very grateful about it. Though I do miss being in person, it has allowed me to kind of speak in different spaces, I think. Thank you for
those. That was it for questions.
Thank you for those questions. I appreciate them.
Thank you for your answers. They were great.
That was great. So I just want to remind everyone in the audience that you can ask a question by clicking the Ask a Question button. It's right beneath the screen. And I'm actually going to ask one of my own questions before giving you guys some time to add to the chat. But Tyler, when you were writing this, the audience that you had in mind, were they Floridians or were they non-Floridians?
Ooh, that's a great question. And I would have to say both. And I say that because what I have kind of picked up about writing about Florida and specifically writing about place is that everybody has their own version of where they're from or where they live. So I kind of try to think about, well, what would Floridians think about writing this? Because, they like, we can be protective over our homes, especially when it's been misrepresented. And so I was thinking a lot about like, okay, what are Floridians going to think about this? And thinking about what I've read. And so that's why I kind of try to frame it as, this is my version of Florida. These are the things that I'm interested in about the state and the misconceptions. So everybody's going to have their own version. And something that I didn't necessarily expect to happen was that people have been saying that it's a good book for Floridians, but it's also interesting for people who aren't from the state or don't have any interest in it, because it's essentially about like grappling and reconciling with where you're from. And I was talking to someone who, she's like, I raised my daughters in Manhattan and they like hate being from Manhattan, which when I was growing up, I wished I was from Manhattan or something, So I think it's like, more often than not, we have complicated relationships to where we were brought up. So it's about reconciling with that. But yeah, it's interesting though too, because a lot of Floridians know their stuff. So I was like, okay, can't say anything too off the wall that's not, factual. I mean, it is nonfiction, but they know their stuff.
Okay. So another question here I think kind of ties into that. Do you think people who haven't lived in Florida, or I'm assuming people who are from Florida, will ever really understand Florida Man?
I think so. I think that, so to me, and what I was interested about Florida Man was that I think it's also interesting, you know, how readers will talk about your work. Someone was talking to me about it being about cancel culture, or just the fact that, you know, we live our lives online. A lot of us do. Some of us try to avoid it as much as possible, but here, you know, it's almost inevitable. And so these headlines are often the worst moments, the lowest moments of people's lives. And these are all allegations. We have to remember that. And how does that, you know, so often it's not actually what happened, but these are often the lowest points of their life. And it has to do with maybe they were dealing with addiction or mental health issues, or, you know, they were having a really bad day or bad year or whatever, you know. And so thinking about, okay, this is a really low moment, and then taking a step back and saying, how would we feel if our headline went viral for like the thing that we're the most ashamed of? You know, so I think that it's about the humanity of how people's lives get put on the internet and then joked about, but it has real implications. Like the person that I wrote about, she lost her job. She she got called out at her new job. People found her online and like called her out in front of her new colleagues. I don't know, that just really speaks to me as someone who does not have the most pristine past, right? So just thinking about that. So I think once we frame it and talk about what it actually is, I think people can understand that.
And do you think that your background as a journalist sort of uniquely qualifies you to have a more objective perspective when it comes to these kind of headlines and having that kind of an interview?
I would say that yes, but I think that what was interesting about writing the book and how it kind of went through different iterations is there was much more like journalistic writing in the earlier drafts. So they were more about, I was really interested in what other people were doing, not so interested in my own life. But there were these moments of kind of humor about my own life that were kind of connecting some of the narrative threads. So my editor and my readers were kind of like, my early readers were like, put some of more of that in there, right? So it took me a while to be comfortable mixing that. And I bring that up to say that I think that the mix of like objective journalism and also the personal really gets us to an interesting place that we wouldn't be able to get to if we were just writing journalistically. Though I do think like the training helped me with research and interviewing and getting access to people. Also, I think having some of the pieces started as journalism, like for magazines. And so I was able to get funding, paid to go write some of this stuff and then expand later. So I think that it all kind of works in that kind of way.
Yeah, that always helps if you can get, you know, a grant.
Exactly.
Okay, so we actually have a question that's for both of you. So maybe Jan, you want to answer it first, and then Tyler can follow up. Can each of you give some of your favorite Florida book recs? So either books by Floridians or books about Florida. And I'm assuming that means excluding your books. So books by other authors.
The first two that come to mind are books by two Haitian writers that live in South Florida. The first one is Michelle Jessica Fieb's A Sky the Color of Chaos, which isn't about Florida. It's about growing up in Haiti under Duvalier's regime. And the other one is Dancing in the Barren Shadow, which also is about Haiti. I'm sort of talking off the top of my head, so I'm just coming up with the first ones that popped to my mind. And that one is like an action adventure story that takes place in Haiti during Papa Doc's regime or Baby Doc's regime.
And I think those are great suggestions. Thank you for that. So I just think, so my grandmother and I during quarantine, we started a podcast and we were reading Florida books and interviewing the authors. So I'm just going to kind of say some of the ones that we read together because she's sitting here with me, though she's off camera. A book that I would recommend, after I said that, the dog started making noise and I lost my train of thought, is we read Craig Pittman's Cattail, which I really recommend because it's about the Florida panther, and it's which is, you know, an endangered species, and it's also our state animal. And I really recommend that book. We read for which would be good would be Susanna Daniels' book, Stiltsville, which is about, which I'm sure, you know, folks in South Florida are probably more aware of the water town of Stiltsville, and I find that so interesting. So that would be definitely a recommendation. We also read this, Sarah Gerard's book, Sunshine State Essays. If you're interested in Florida about nonfiction, I mean, there's a lot of great books about Florida too that like stretch back. There's a lot of great writing about Florida, and definitely shout out to Julie Marie Wade, of course. Any of her books, those would be the ones off the top of my head.
Well, those are all great titles, and actually we posted so many of those, you know, so they're clearly titles that resonate with our audience. Maybe you can give us the name of the podcast in the chat so that we can listen. And in the meantime, let's see, we have another question from Susanna. Florida is by definition intersectional with unique ecosystems, a lot of tourism, agricultural communities, theme parks, club scene, high fashion, business, and banking. What part or community of Florida do you think hasn't been heard from?
I love that question. So so thoughtful. So I would just say, I think there are so many underrepresented communities in Florida. So we have a lot of great Florida writers and great Florida writing, but there's so much more that we need to be talking about. And that intersectionality aspect is really important. I mean, personally, I'm interested in hearing from more queer voices, from more, especially when it comes to nonfiction writing. I'm interested in hearing a lot of, I think an issue that's really needs to be talked about probably more is infrastructure, specifically as it connects to affordable housing for aging folks who are aging. Those are just some things that pop to my head. And something that I think that's getting a lot of attention, and the book just came out about it too, is the water quality in Florida. Water is a huge issue. So I would think that. I also think too, sorry, I'm rambling about this, but there's just so much. Like, I think agriculture and like the impact that it has on the state, specifically for immigrants, and specifically like its connection to chattel slavery is really important, and something that doesn't really, I don't see discussed too often. So I would say those connections I would like to read more about.
Okay, and we have one more question for the audience. And I think this applies to both of you as well, and sort of ties into the previous question. Are there any other aspects of Florida that you plan to explore or that you'd like to explore more in your writing?
I moved from Pompano Beach to Hialeah, so I'm like in a whole different country here. And I think at some point I'd like to try writing about Hialeah, although I'm not quite sure how to go about it because I don't speak the language. I think I must say I don't speak Spanish at least 5 times a week. But it's a real interesting community. It's unlike any place I've ever lived before.
Mm-hmm. So I am currently working on another book in the baby stages, and it is about queer communities in Florida, and specifically as it's connected to community and writing and text. So I bring that up to say, just if anybody wants to reach out and knows anyone, I'm looking at different communities, like specifically, I'm looking at like drag as a text, the histories of drag, stuff like that. But yeah, there's so much to talk about with Florida, and I hope to continue to write about it.
Well, I think there will be definitely a lot of people who will continue to read about it. So do you guys have any closing remarks? Any final things you'd like to tell our audience?
Well, thank you for coming and supporting Books and Books.
Yes, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Great conversation. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just want to quickly thank you for hosting so much and for organizing. And thank you everyone for coming out and spending time and space with us. And just, I hope everyone's taking care and keep it Florida.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone in the audience. And if you haven't ordered your copy of The Thing About Florida yet, you can do so by clicking the green button. Or even better, if you feel comfortable, please come see us in store. We miss you guys so much, and we really want to see your smiling faces. So thank you again, and have a wonderful evening. Bye, guys.